Thanks. I sent a tweet out last night which said something like corruption about Grenfell, corruption not cladding, social murder not corporate manslaughter. By which I meant, cladding's part of the issue, but it's not really the issue, it's corruption, as Dave's indicated. And corporate manslaughter is an issue, but it's not really the issue, it's social murder. And I'm going to kind of focus on those last two things. But I'm going to say something in my 10 minutes about corporate manslaughter. As I say, not because the law is the main way of preventing corporate and state harm, far from it, but it is one tool that might be used in that struggle. And I also say this, I talk about corporate manslaughter as someone who's not a lawyer. That's the kind of thing, the kind of way you introduce yourselves at parties. Hello, my name's Stephen, I'm not a lawyer, right? So I'm not a lawyer. It's been the case for about 50 years in this country, in the UK, that companies could be prosecuted, could be tried for corporate manslaughter. But to do so, it also had to be the case that one or several directors or senior or owners of that company also had to be tried for gross negligence manslaughter, tried as individuals. Without one, the individuals being tried, the companies couldn't be tried. And that meant that only a handful of very small companies were ever successfully prosecuted for corporate manslaughter, where the corporation could be identified with the small business owner or the sole director of the company. And in the wake of a series of disasters, Clapham, King's Cross, Ladbroke Grove, Purley, Piper Alva, Bradford City, football stadium disaster, Hillsborough, Zeebrugge, it became very clear that the law, as it stood, couldn't deal with large, complex organisations, which also, of course, managed to kill many, many more people in one hit than very small companies that could partly be captured by the law. That led to a law commission set of proposals in 1996 for a reform law of corporate manslaughter. That was resisted by major political parties for about 12 years until it finally came into law in 2008. But the key change in that long struggle over the process of the new law was that the original proposals by the Law Commission were proposals about corporate manslaughter, but also included clauses which allowed for directors to be prosecuted under that legal rubric. When business and indeed when political parties stopped opposing those proposals, when that clause was removed, and the corporate manslaughter law, which we now have on the books, doesn't allow, in fact explicitly says, that individual directors and senior managers have no liability. Section 18 of that Act. So, what's happened under this new law since 2008? That's 9 and a bit years. There have been 21 convictions, 21 cases where corporations have been successfully prosecuted for manslaughter and 3 acquittals. None of those companies have been large organisations. None of those companies that have been prosecuted. All of them could have been prosecuted under the previous law, it seems to me at least, not being a lawyer, but I'm pretty certain about that, with perhaps one exception. What has happened though, is that whereas previously the directors or senior managers used to have to be prosecuted alongside the company, under the new law they can't be, right? So under the new law, senior managers have been dobbing in the company, handing over the evidence as further immunity from prosecution outside the Corporate Manslaughter Act. So what we have is corporations, a small number, or small companies, ending up in the dock, but directors and senior owners, in fact, enjoying greater impunity. Okay, what does the Corporate Manslaughter and Corporate Homicide Act require? It requires that the organisation at fault must be a corporate body, by which it means a private company, or a local authority. So both those boxes get ticked in the context of Grenfell Tower. The responsible organisation or organisations must have owed a duty of care towards the person or persons who died, and the duty of care has to be of a particular kind, including, and I quote, organisations and manufacturers towards those who buy their products, local councils in the provision of particular services towards those receiving the services, other organisations involved in the supply of goods or services towards those receiving them, and organisations involved in construction or maintenance operations towards those affected by their activities. Tick, 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 in the context of Grenfell Tower. Further, for a prosecution, there must be a failure in the way in which the organisation, any of those organisations we previously mentioned, in the way in which the organisation was managed or organised, which amounted to a gross breach of the duty of care I've just referred to in those different guises. This requires evidence that the failure, quote, fell far below what can reasonably be required. Reasonably be expected. It's also the case for a prosecution under the Act that, quote, a substantial element of the management failure must be at a senior management level. This is defined as the persons who play significant roles in the making of decisions about how the whole or substantial part of its activities of the organisation are managed or organised, and the actual managing or organising of the whole or substantial part of those activities. In other words, I mean, based upon what we know already, based upon what we know, Joe referred to the warnings of the Grenfell Tenant Action Group prior to what happened in mid-June this year. We know that senior management in the council, we know that senior figures in the tenants management organisation knew of the risks. We know that they knew of them, not least because of Lacanau and the inquests and the fire safety prosecution that finally came to an end in March of this year, despite the fact that the Lacanau house fire was in 2009. We know that there's prima facie evidence for a case of manslaughter to be taken against one or several organisations involved in the Grenfell Tower disaster. Doesn't mean that they'll be successful. Proving a gross breach and meeting the senior management test are both difficult feats in law and haven't yet really been tested on a new law. But that there's prima facie evidence seems to me to be absolutely clear. What would be the downsides of any prosecution of the council, of the TMO and the private contractors? Well, one of the downsides, I think, is that almost certainly senior individuals, going back to the point I made earlier, senior individuals in those organisations would evade legal accountability. They would exchange their threat to a prosecution for the organisations, for the council, for example. They would guarantee impunity for themselves. Senior councillors would likely guarantee impunity were the council to be prosecuted, for instance. The second and kind of ironic consequence of a prosecution, were it to be successful, was that the sanction, if let's say the council is successfully prosecuted for corporate manslaughter, then the sanction will be a fine. And the fines in the 21 cases up to this point have ranged from £8,000 to £600,000. And it's likely the case were the council, it's possible that the council would receive a fine higher than £600,000. Who would pay the fucking fine? Who would pay the fine? The fine would be dispersed to the innocent. The fine would be dispersed to the poll tax. It's not called the poll tax anymore, is it? I still think it's the poll tax payers, right? The fine would be paid for by employees of the council. The fine would be paid for by the people who relied on the services of the council. Right? So that fine, whatever level it was, the higher it is, the greater would local people be hit. Okay? Not the powerful people in that borough. That's also not to mention, by the way, the legal cost involved. Southwark Council, after Lacanau, spent £3.34 million in legal fees around the inquest, defending its role around the inquest in relation to those 6 deaths. That's not even to talk about the legal fees it incurred in terms of the health and safety charges for which he was offended, or the fire safety charges, which is eventually found guilty. So likely the poor would pay, yet again. As always, title of a famous criminology book, the rich get richer, the poor get prison. What would be the good things that might come out of a successful prosecution or prosecution in this case? Well, I think the most important thing is it would send a symbol, it would send a message. It would mark what happened. What happened at Grenfell was many things, some of which we know about and some of which we're yet to find out about. But amongst those many things, it was a crime. And it would mark that out clearly. And to make the converse point, if there were not a successful prosecution, it would also kind of send out the other message, which is that what happened at Grenfell Tower wasn't really criminal. And we all know that it was a crime. We all know, despite the fact that most of us aren't lawyers. Illegally, I think there's a very strong case that Grenfell Tower will test the new law and will successfully test the new law, and the council at least will be the first large organisation to be successfully prosecuted under the Corporate Manslaughter and Corporate Homicide Act in 2007. And if it isn't, I think that law will be proven to be worth less than the paper it's written on. But morally, to close where I began and where the others referred to, morally, I think we also know that what happened at Grenfell wasn't manslaughter, it was murder. And it was, to use that phrase, which I've been using for a few years and has been circulating now around this disaster, this tragedy, it was social murder. And social murder, to remind you, was a phrase that was first used over 100 years ago, 1845, by a guy called Friedrich Engels, who was a good friend of someone called Karl Marx, who you will have heard of. And Engels defined social murder in this way, and I'll read this quotation out and I'll stop. When one individual inflicts bodily injury upon another, such injury that death results, we call that deed manslaughter. When the assailant knew in advance that the injury would be fatal, we call this deed murder. One-on-one intentional violence, we call it murder. But when, he continues, when society places hundreds of proletarians in such a position that they inevitably meet a too early and an unnatural death, one which is quite as much a death by violence as that by the sword or the bullet, when it deprives thousands of the necessaries of life, places them under conditions in which they cannot live, forces them to remain in such conditions until that death ensues as the inevitable consequence, knows that these thousands of victims must perish, and yet permits these conditions to remain, its deed is murder just as surely as the deed of a single individual. What happened at Grenfell Tower, Engels knew then, we know now, is social murder. Thank you very much.